Some names in There's Treasure Inside feel simple at first. They pass by in a sentence, almost like scenery. But every now and then a name opens into an entire world, and Paul Broca is one of those names. Because Broca is not just a man from a textbook. He is one of those figures who stood right at the edge of a change in how human beings understood themselves. Before Broca, people could talk about the mind, the soul, memory, speech, personality, but the brain still held a kind of mystery that medicine could not pin down with confidence. People argued over whether mental functions lived everywhere in the brain or whether specific abilities belonged to specific places. Then Broca stepped into that argument with a dead patient, a damaged brain, and a conclusion that changed science. Paul Broca was born in 1824 in Saint-Foy-la-Grande, in southwestern France. He trained as a physician and surgeon in Paris and built a reputation early as a serious, disciplined medical thinker. He was not a dreamy mystic. He was precise, anatomical, clinical, the kind of man who trusted what could be observed, measured, dissected, compared. That mattered, because the 19th century was full of huge ideas that were still fighting over evidence. Medicine was modernizing, but it was also crowded with speculation. Broca belonged to the camp that wanted the body to speak for itself. For a while, his work ranged widely: surgery, pathology, anatomy. But the case that fixed his name in history came in 1861, when he studied a patient named Louis-Victor Leborgne. In the hospital, Leborgne had a nickname: Tan. That was because for years that was almost the only syllable he could say. Imagine that for a second. A man who could understand much of what was said to him. A man who still had thoughts, frustration, intention, personality. But when he tried to speak, the mouth of language seemed blocked. Out of all the words in the world, what came out again and again was tan. That kind of case had power because it made the problem visible. This was not a vague complaint. It was not an invisible pain. It was one broken function standing in front of a doctor and refusing to hide. When Leborgne died, Broca examined his brain and found a lesion in the left frontal region. That finding gave Broca something earlier generations had not been able to show so clearly. A physical injury matched a specific loss of speech. Today, people say Broca's area almost casually, as if it had always existed on the map. But in that moment, it was not just a label. It was a claim. Broca argued that articulate speech had a seat in the left frontal part of the brain. That mattered so much because it was one of the first major anatomical proofs that a particular human function could be linked to a particular cerebral region. That idea sounds obvious now only because it won. At the time, it was a crack in the wall. If speech could be localized, then what else could be localized? Memory, movement, vision, emotion, recognition. Suddenly, the brain was no longer only a sacred gray mass hidden in the skull. It was becoming a geography. And like any geography, once one border appears, people start drawing the rest. Broca did not stop with one patient. More cases followed. More lesions. More comparisons. Over time, the left frontal speech area became a cornerstone of neurology. Even now, damage in that region is associated with a form of aphasia in which speech can become slow, effortful, and stripped down, while the person may still know very well what they want to say. That is part of what makes Broca's story so haunting. It is not just about language. It is about the gap between thought and expression. The distance between the mind that knows and the mouth that cannot deliver. And that gap is terrifying because speech feels so natural until it is taken away. Most of us live as if language is automatic. We reach for words without thinking about the machinery behind them. Broca's work forced people to confront a harder truth. Speech is physical. Meaning is physical. Damage a small piece of tissue, and suddenly the self can become trapped behind broken output. But the story does not end with a triumphal chapter in neurology, because Paul Broca was not just the man of speech. He was also a major figure in physical anthropology, and this is where the record gets darker. Broca founded important institutions in French anthropology. He helped build laboratories, societies, journals, schools. He measured skulls, compared cranial forms, and developed techniques meant to classify human difference. In his time, that looked to many people like rigorous science. In ours, much of it reads as a warning. Broca worked within ideas about race that are now discredited and morally poisonous. He treated major human racial groups as if they were separate species or near separate categories in ways tied to hierarchy, mixture, and supposed biological worth. He wrote about which mixtures were beneficial and which were harmful. He put numbers and measurements into arguments that helped give old prejudices the appearance of scientific legitimacy. That matters because it ruins the easy version of the genius story. It would be simpler if history gave us heroes who were clean in every direction. Broca was not one of them. He helped illuminate one of the great questions of human neuroscience, and he also participated in a field that dressed bias in the language of objectivity. The same faith in measurement that helped him make a true discovery also fed false and damaging claims about human difference. That contradiction is not accidental. It is one of the central lessons of the 19th century. Measurement alone does not make a science wise. Precision does not make it moral. A caliper in the hand of a brilliant man can still become a weapon if the question itself is corrupt. And maybe that is part of why Broca remains such a compelling figure. He is not just a landmark in medicine. He is a case study in the power and danger of reduction. He wanted to locate things, to pin them down, to assign structure to complexity. Sometimes that impulse opened truth. Sometimes it flattened human beings into categories they should never have been forced into. Even the famous speech finding is more complicated today than the clean textbook version people learned first. Modern neuroscience still recognizes Broca's area as crucial for speech production. But language is not a single switch in a single spot. The brain works through networks. Broca's area connects with other regions and appears to play roles not only in speech production, but in aspects of language comprehension and sensory motor integration as well. So even the discovery that made his name permanent has widened beyond the original dramatic image of one injured place and one lost function. That does not erase the importance of what he found. It just reminds us that science usually enters history as a headline and stays alive as revision. Broca drew one of the first reliable boundaries on the map. Later generations had to redraw the terrain around it. There is something almost symbolic about the patient called tan. One stranded syllable. One broken bridge between thought and sound. One body that forced an era to pay attention. Without Le Borgne, Broca might still have been remembered in French medical history. But with Le Borgne, he became part of one of the deepest questions a person can ask. Where does speech live? And once you ask that, the next questions come fast. Where does memory live? Where does identity live? What part of the brain carries grief? What part gives us music? What part lets us pray, lie, confess, dream, remember a mother's voice, or fail to say the one sentence that matters before it is too late? Broca did not answer all of that. Nobody could. But he pushed medicine into a new age by proving that those questions could be asked in flesh as well as philosophy. Then history did what it always does. It complicated the man. It exposed the parts of his work that should not be admired. It left us with a figure who cannot be flattened into saint or villain without losing the truth. So if the name Paul Broca sends you down a side road, it is a road worth taking. Because his story is not just about a brain region. It is about what happens when human beings discover that the things they call mind and voice and self are rooted in matter. It is about the shock of realizing that language can be injured, that identity can be measured badly, that science can reveal and distort in the same century, sometimes in the same pair of hands. Broca found one of the doors into modern neuroscience. He also reminds us that opening a door is not the same thing as knowing where to walk after you step through it. And that may be the real reason his name still lingers. Not because history loves tidy heroes, but because history keeps returning to people who changed what could be known, and then forced everyone after them to decide what should be done with that knowledge.